everybody. Today we are debating whether or not abortion should be a legal right, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here. Thanks for coming back. We are stoked for this epic debate, as today we will be debating, as mentioned, whether or not abortion should be a legal right. I'm going to do a couple of really quick house cleaning type things for the channel. This is like 2 weeks since I've been able to stream. I've missed everybody. I've missed this. This is honestly just such a fun way to come back for such an exciting, epic debate. So with that, want to just mention up front, and then like I said, we'll mention the rest of our kind of house cleaning type stuff during the little break periods between the timed sections. And so at the start, I do want to mention, though, we are pumped, as a lot of you guys are familiar with, the gentleman named Kent Hovind. We were supposed to have that debate yesterday, and he was going to debate whether or not evolution is a dangerous idea. The only trick is last minute, we had a little bit of a delayed start because I forgot my computer cord at home, and then Kent Hovind's wife, there was an issue that he just had to make sure she was okay. It's not life-threatening, she's okay, but it was something that we were like, totally, Kent, we want you to put your family first. So we were glad that she's okay, and that he will be coming on tomorrow, which would be a blast. So if you enjoy a good old Kent Hovind debate, that should be a lot of fun. And Kent Hovind, speaking of, is that a lot of people don't know, but Kent Hovind is actually Destiny's biological father. And I'm just kidding, I made that up, not true. But so basically, they debated before though, and then it was an epic debate, much like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. It was a big one. So with that, I want to mention, if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button, as we have debates often on religion, politics, and we're also doing editions now where Saturday is Poli-Sci Saturday. We'll be doing politics, political science type stuff, and then Faithful or Faithless Fridays. That will be a regular thing as well. And then we are also going to have Origins Talk Tuesdays. There's creation, evolution, Big Bang, science, all that good stuff. So, and by the way, last thing I just want to mention with that, no matter if you are Christian, atheist, Muslim, Republican, Democrat, Jedi, or Sith, we want you to feel welcome here. We are really trying to build an eclectic community. With that, I want to say thanks so much to our debaters. Their links are in the description. So if you're enjoying this debate today, you're like, oh, I want to hear more, you can find them in the description. And in addition to that, want to mention, I'm going to update a link for Kelsey. So they're on Facebook as well. I'm going to put that in the description in a second. And then want to mention all of your super chats today will be going to Save the Children, which is also linked in the description. The charity watchdog, Charity Navigator, has given them excellent ratings. They are a superb charity that basically nonpartisan, fully neutral. They feed starving children throughout the world and also work on educating people in impoverished places in the world, so such as how to read and so on. And with that, thrilled to have you here. Want to just mention, our debaters are epic debaters, and I'm not just saying that. You have to believe me. Destiny, if people type in, like, let's say YouTube debaters on Google, Destiny's name is probably going to be the first one that comes up, especially for politics. Destiny is a big timer, so we're thrilled to have him here, as mentioned, linked in the description. And Kelsey as well is a superb debater and also the president of Secular Pro-Life. So an organization that's been around for a while and has gotten a following. So want to encourage you to check out both parties. And with that, thanks for your patience. I am just going to read the format for you. So last detail is that there will be 15-minute opening statements from each speaker, followed by an 8-minute rebuttal from each speaker, a 30-minute open discussion period, and then 5-minute closings, followed by 25 minutes of Q&A. And I want to let you know that the debaters don't have to use their full time allotted to them. That's up to them. And so with that, I am going to set the timer. Usually we have the affirmative start. And so Destiny, if you're willing, though, I'm willing to defer to you as the debaters. If you guys would like it differently, like if Kelsey wanted to go first or vice versa, that's really ultimately up to you. Otherwise, Destiny, are you okay?
I don't mind going first. Up to you all.
If she wants to, otherwise I can do it. I don't have a preference.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Want to apologize in advance for any issues that I may have with audio. Unfortunately, the power went out at my house shortly before this live stream was to begin, so I am on my phone, and I'm also in the only place with natural light, which is on my balcony. You probably hear my neighbor's dogs barking. You'll hear cars going by. You'll probably hear some thunder from the storm that knocked out the power in the first place, but also some more pleasant sounds like birds chirping, hopefully. So again, apologies in advance for any audio issues that we may encounter. I am not a big YouTuber. I don't have the experience with all of that setup that others do, so I kind of put this together on the fly. As you said, I'm the president of Secular Pro-Life. That's a volunteer job by day. I'm a lawyer, but my area of practice is not in constitutional rights or anything like that. This isn't a setup. My day-to-day practice is pretty boring, contract stuff, condo, HOA stuff. I watched your earlier debate with the Meds Peds, and I think we really agree on a lot of things. We agree on more than we disagree, truly. You responded to a lot of her arguments with things that I wanted to say. I thought your comments on bodily autonomy were thoughtful. You didn't allow any of the sort of ableist line of pro-choice thinking to go by. So I thought you did a really good job with that. And my understanding is that we agree on the unborn baby being alive and being human. We agree on abortion ending a human life. We agree that abortion is generally unjustified, with the exception of mother's life or severe health issues. So we're just here today, I believe, to talk about the public policy side of it, whether those judgments about the ethics of abortion ought to be codified into policy. Is that fair?
I don't know if I'm gonna let all of that. I don't know if I'm gonna concede that much in this conversation.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't watch everything you've spoken about on abortion because it's quite extensive. But if you start from a place of believing that abortion ends a human life, then what we're really talking about here is the role of government, whether the government has a role to play in preventing violence between private parties. And in general, the answer I think would be yes. Most legislation prohibiting violence between private parties is not controversial, but I understand that pregnancy is a special case and abortion is a special case, and that we have cultural norms around it that differ very much from other forms of killing. That said, I don't find the argument that banning abortion is an inappropriate imposition of morality to be convincing, because all laws impose morality to some extent. Even the law saying that you have to pay your condominium assessments is on some level a moral judgment that people ought to pay their condominium assessments. So just saying that you don't want to impose your morality on others doesn't really cut it for me. My concern about I think people who come to this saying I'm personally pro-life but politically pro-choice, I think they're coming at it in good faith. I don't mean to disparage you at all. My concern with that is that you wind up creating essentially a conception lottery, for lack of a better phrase, that because you happen to have pro-life beliefs, or your partner happens to have pro-life beliefs, your child is protected and safe from day one, whereas another child who happens to have the misfortune of being conceived by pro-choice parents winds up lacking that protection. And I realize, of course, that there are all kinds of inequalities of conception, from health to income, that can affect you throughout your life. But why exacerbate that? Why add to that by creating this conception lottery as to whether you even get to birth in the first place. So that's my general view. I'm open to a freewheeling discussion about whatever may come up in this time together, or at least as long as my phone battery will allow.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Kelsey. We appreciate that. And for Destiny's opening, I am resetting the clock, and I will start on your first word, Destiny.
Okay, this is going to be a lot shorter. But basically, I think that when we talk about abortion, we're basically placing this on three separate pillars. And we can kind of move through any of these three, but it makes probably the most sense to start with the first one. And the first one is the moral right. So I would argue, from a pro-choice point of view, I would argue that the autonomy that a woman has over her body is not something that should be threatened by the state. And I would say that in this case, it shouldn't be threatened by the state, because I don't think it's reasonable to assert that a fetus up to at least 6 months could possibly be endowed with the same rights that any other kind of person could be. And then we can kind of, we'll probably, a lot of this discussion will center on what we would consider to be a person, or how we would grant personhood. But I would kind of argue that the position that we would take there is that we typically grant personhood to people that have an experience like ours. So for instance, the conscious experience that we have as humans are things that we extend to other humans, and that seems to be the thing that we protect in terms of granting like moral consideration to other people. So for example, we wouldn't grant moral consideration to a corpse, even though biologically it might match up with a lot of different things. We don't typically grant moral consideration to things that don't have like conscious experiences yet. So like stillborns or people without brains. That seems like an extreme example, but like for instance, if somebody is undergoing like a horrible thing that's like destroying their brain and they're in a coma, we don't grant moral consideration to them. So that would be the area that I would start with on that. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar, this is kind of tautological, but I mean, obviously abortion is a legal right. The Supreme Court has affirmed this at least 2 times. The Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court made the decision that you ought to have the autonomy of your body protected against the state, and then that was reaffirmed in Casey v. Planned Parenthood when it said that states can't make unreasonable laws encroaching on that. Now, obviously, it should be allowed because it's legal is kind of tautological, but yeah, we could throw that in there as another pillar. And then the third pillar would be pragmatically, it just makes more sense for society to allow you to have an abortion. There are going to be women that will seek it regardless of whether or not it's legal. Letting women plan their own families produces so many more better outcomes for society from a consequentialist point of view. So for instance, if you're not being forced to give birth to children, your life is going to be better. The life of lives of your future children will be better. The lives of everybody around you will be better, because people born to single parent households are probably more likely to commit crime, or more likely to leech off of fiscal budgets, welfare, stuff like that. So those are the 3 kind of pillars that I would justify pro-choice or pro-abortion stances on, and then we can discuss any of those 3. How much time do I have left?
You've got 12 minutes.
I could say more, but yeah, we'll leave it there for back and forth or whatever. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'm fine with being a little more informal about this. I'm going to start with your second pillar, and yes, it's tautological, but I wanted to expand on something that you said, which was that the Supreme Court has found a right to bodily autonomy. I don't think that's quite accurate. So the public discussion of abortion rights takes place on a very different ground than what the Supreme Court originally used in Roe v. Wade and the companion cases. The legal argument, the Supreme Court argument, has centered around a right to privacy, which is not so much part of the public discourse anymore. And even within legal circles, even within pro-choice legal circles, there's been a lot of criticism of Roe v. Wade for some leaps of logic that it took. The right to privacy is not explicitly stated in the Constitution. It's something that's developed over some years of case law, it started out, I think, being used for noble purposes. So to give an example, the right to privacy was used to strike down a law that had prohibited parents from enrolling their children in private schools where languages other than English were spoken. This was an old, anti-immigrant motivated law, trying to force families that spoke other languages to assimilate and not to educate their children that way. And the Supreme Court said no, that there's a right to privacy within the family sphere that permits that type of education. So that really was the origin of the right to privacy idea, which has been expanded to a point of allowing abortion, and that expansion was pretty unprincipled. From a legal point of view, the decision doesn't make a whole lot of sense, which is why when it was revisited in Casey, they had somewhat different. They still talked about privacy, but they had a somewhat different approach, focusing more on some of the things that you mentioned. This idea that women benefit from abortion in terms of being able to participate in society and have careers and that sort of thing. The feminist argument. Obviously, I'm a woman. I'm a cis woman. I have a uterus. I have some sympathy for people who want to improve women's station in life. But at the same time, I do find it offensive because I myself am a woman with a successful career, and I haven't killed anybody for it, and I don't need to kill anybody for it. And it feels like an industry and an ideology that I deeply oppose is trying to take credit for my professional successes. I realize that being offended is not an argument for or against anything, but the idea that abortion is necessary for women's equality also bothers me because the premise has never been tested. We have never had a system in place where women are genuinely equal and supported without abortion. Roe v. Wade was in 1973. At that point, there was no Pregnancy Discrimination Act. It was perfectly legal to fire someone for getting pregnant. Marital rape, still perfectly legal in most states. Up until the early 90s, I believe, is when the last of those loopholes were finally resolved, at least here in the United States. So it seems to me that we really haven't, forgive me for sounding like a hippie, we haven't given peace a chance. We haven't given the nonviolent approach to gender equality a chance. We just went straight to abortion and then tried to tack on some other things later. But when even today, when you see this, there was just a few weeks ago an open letter signed by CEOs of some major Fortune 500 companies saying that abortion bans are bad for business. And when you see that, and when you look at how awful their maternity leave policies are, you can't help but think that there's something a little schemy there. I've gotten off track. I know you had several other points, but that's just my 2 cents. Now, getting back to none of the Supreme Court decisions have been based on a right of bodily autonomy. None of the abortion decisions have been based on a right of bodily autonomy. There's an old case called Buck v. Bell on forced sterilization. It's never been reversed. Technically, forced sterilization remains a possibility. I mean, obviously no one's doing it anymore, but there's no bodily autonomy right codified into either the Constitution or the Supreme Court's abortion decisions. That just isn't the direction that they've gone in. The Supreme Court's justifications are very different from the pro-choice movement's justifications, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Are we just, do I understand right, we're in the open discussion right now?
I think so. Yeah. And I just felt like I'd been talking a long time, so I wanted to
okay.
Sorry to interrupt. To move over. I can keep talking if you want me to. I can talk all day.
Well, yeah, so I guess I can respond to a couple of these. So, I mean, when we talk about like the Supreme Court case, kind of like affirming like a right to privacy or whatever in terms of how they interpreted or the interpretation of Roe v. Wade, I think that's kind of predicated on the idea that a fetus isn't like a real person. So therefore, like, so the state doesn't have an interest or isn't a reasonable party to having a say in whether or not a woman gets an abortion or not, because we consider it the woman's body is her own thing that she has domain over, and the state shouldn't intervene there, unless we want to argue that a fetus is a life, which would take us over to the moral side of things. I take a little bit of issue with the framing that that because something's not explicitly in the Constitution but developed from case law, that it is somehow not as important to law. I mean, the entire idea of the Supreme Court even giving us these types of things is not in the Constitution, right? Of course, this comes from Marbury v. Madison. The whole judicial review thing is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. So I mean, like, I think case law is pretty important. Yeah. This is like a really weird thing, and we can branch off into the morality thing. When you say like you haven't killed anybody to reach your level of a career, now I don't know your personal life, so I can't really speculate. But I mean, a lot of children are killed due to miscarriages that happen without the woman even knowing it. Like, if we were to seriously contend that from the moment of conception somebody is considered a human life, then we would also have to say that like the worst genocide of all time is occurring literally every single day in the bathroom when a woman goes to use the restroom and has a period that seems a little bit worse than usual, and it actually ends up being like an early term miscarriage, which seems like a position to me that would be pretty hard to defend, that we should be taking active measures to prevent accidental miscarriages if we actually believed that was happening on a daily basis. Real quick, let me just. I just wrote these down. Let me just make sure I respond. I've got 2 more points. The second one was whether or not abortion was necessary for women's equality, or I guess is the last point. I don't know if you can say that we haven't given it a chance. The idea that we haven't given non-abortion a chance, I would argue that we give that a chance every single day in the United States. There are plenty of children that are born to single-parent households. The overwhelming majority of these children are born to women. It's much easier for a man to get a woman pregnant and walk away from that relationship, never pay child support, never see the child or do anything, than it is for a woman to walk away from that relationship once she's already given birth to the child. So, I mean, if we were to make abortion completely illegal, I don't see that experiment playing out any differently than what already plays out today in American life, where if a woman can't have an abortion or chooses not to have an abortion, the man is like 95% more likely to walk out on that than the woman is. And that's all I got.
Okay. Skipping back to the miscarriage, I think you are equivocating a bit on, when you say genocide. I mean, we think of genocide as being like deliberate acts of killing. Miscarriages are natural deaths. There are my point of view is that miscarriage is a tragedy. I wish it weren't controversial to say that miscarriage is a tragedy. I think the reason that we give it less attention is that we don't have good ways of preventing it. To the extent that the research has been done, what we find is that the vast majority, particularly when we're talking about earlier miscarriages, wind up being due to genetic defects that were present from the moment of conception and that we couldn't possibly have done anything to prevent. So, I agree that the pro-life movement ought to care about babies who die by miscarriage and abortion. Death is death. I think the reason that abortion gets so much more attention is just because we feel like there's something to be done, whereas with miscarriage, 99% of the time, it's nobody's fault. It's natural death. People die, and at the very beginning of life and in old age, they just are the most vulnerable times for people to die. That's life. That's reality. I think that you can accept that natural death just happens sometimes. If I hear that a 95-year-old has died, I'm going to say, oh, that's too bad, but I'm not going to be, marching in the streets demanding better health care for 95-year-olds, because I'm sure that death wasn't preventable. It just is what it is. And I think you can take that position without creating a moral inconsistency.
Okay. Okay, sorry, just writing this down. Okay, so I think that we kind of run into a little bit of a conundrum here. So if we admit that a miscarriage is that like natural death can happen, I don't think the idea that natural death happens, I don't think that we just let that argument slide for any other people that we would like fully endow with human rights. So for an example of this, due to the evolution we've had as people, due to the way that our children grow up, it is very hard for a human female to give birth to a human child. Our heads are huge, and we have more trouble than any other species. Our children are worthless until 2 years old or whatever, that they can barely walk. However,
I'm not going to concede worthlessness, but okay.
Sure, yeah, I wouldn't say worthless. I mean worthless in terms of capability, in terms of being capable of surviving on their own. So, so like as a result of all of this, right, human delivery is a very difficult thing compared to the delivery that other animals go through. But we would never just like allow women to give birth in their homes and then a lot of them die and be like, oh, well, natural death, it's part of the circle of life. Sometimes women just die. Sometimes babies stick their fingers in, wall sockets. Like we usually take active measures to prevent natural deaths. Short of like, your example of somebody being 95 years old and in a hospital and dying or whatever. Typically we try like really hard to prevent all as much natural death as we can. People with chronic diseases, genetic disorders, whatever. Like we do a ton of research. People with cystic fibrosis, etc. I could list a million examples. So yeah. I kind of reject this idea that like, well, a ton of miscarriages happen and it's just natural death and that's okay. Like, it seems like you have one of two routes that you can go here. Either one, you can say, well, a miscarriage just kind of happens in their fetuses. So, even though it's sad, we don't care as much, in which case you're kind of relegating them to either second-class citizens or something that isn't getting the same, moral consideration as like a normal person in society, in which case I think you're running down a slope there that very easily leads you to abortion. Or two, we're going to have to seriously contend that every single time a miscarriage happens, it's actually like a loss of life, like another like life that we should be defending the same as any other, in which case I think there are a lot of moral implications to that would be really uncomfortable. So for example, like the existence of fertility clinics would be deeply immoral, because why would you actively try to get somebody pregnant knowing that there is a high degree of chance that the fetus is going to die? Like I don't even know if that would be considered moral. Should we be aggressively screening people for like first trimester pregnancies? Like if you've ever had a sexual encounter, should you constantly be doing a pregnancy test to make sure that you're not going to accidentally miscarry a child? Because I'm sure there are a lot of miscarriages happen early on due to negligence, because somebody just doesn't know they're pregnant. Should we punish people for those early miscarriages? Should we actually have investigations into those types of miscarriages to see if those people actually miscarried due to their own negligence or fault? The same in the way that we would investigate like if a child dies in a household, if that was due to parent negligence or whatever. I think all of these things kind of logically follow from the moral assertion that, a miscarriage is like a loss of life, the same way that a child dying would be a loss of life.
I do take the position that a miscarriage is a loss of life, and I think doing so affirms the grief that families feel when they experience a miscarriage. But I don't think that the rest of your implications really follow. What we're dealing with here really is a technological limitation. Back in the day when there was nothing to be done to prevent maternal mortality, people just said that was life and the gods had disfavored us, or whatever explanations that they came up with in ancient times. Didn't mean that women weren't people, didn't mean that women who died in childbirth weren't people. We save the lives that we can, and at this point in our knowledge as a species, we just don't have the ability to prevent most miscarriages or even know what causes them. I mean, you're going around saying, oh, it could be the mother's negligence. I don't think there's any basis for that in any kind of research. I'm very hesitant to blame a woman for who's grieving the loss of her child and suggest that it was in any way her fault, because we just don't know. And from what we can tell, it seems to be a genetic issue the vast majority of the time. But I feel like we've gotten kind of far afield from the topic of whether abortion should be legal. So if you don't mind, I wanted to redirect to something that you said early on, because I'm sure this is going to come up in comments from viewers, which is the idea that women are going to abort anyway, so we should at least make it safe and legal. And I want to talk about this because the pro-choice person who makes like the back alley argument, and that's their reason for being pro-choice, is really my favorite kind of pro-choicer, because we're starting from the same goal of wanting to save lives, right? This is really an argument about data. Pro-choice people and advocacy groups have a habit of comparing data from different countries and saying, oh, well, here's a country that has legal abortion and their maternal mortality rates are good, and here's a country that outlaws abortion right to life and their maternal mortality rates are really bad. The problem with comparing countries like that is that there's just so many other variables at play, particularly income, because low SES countries tend to have more pro-life legislation because the pro-choice movement originated in wealthier countries. That's just an accident of history. And two can play that game. I can say, Chile has pro-life laws and its maternal mortality rates are way better than other countries in the region. Or I could point to Europe and say, wow, they have much tighter restrictions on abortion than the United States, and the United States maternal mortality rate is awful. Two can play that game. It's apples and oranges. The better approach, I think, is to look within the same country before and after changes in abortion policy. And my read of that literature is that it does not support the claim that legalized abortion saves women's lives. I just haven't seen, that there. If you starting with the United States, before and after Roe, if you look at a graph of women's health outcomes before and after Roe, things just get better and better and better over time, and there's no spike or change in the slope of that graph that you can even identify where is 1973 on that graph. So I appreciate the I appreciate the goals behind the back alley argument. I appreciate that people are coming at it from a good-hearted place. I just disagree about the data.
I don't necessarily disagree with anything in here. I don't think that saying that women are going to abort anyway is necessarily a good argument to make it legal. More so that just if you predicate this on the idea that a fetus isn't really considered a person, that we don't grant moral consideration to it the same way we would a normal person, then in that case, abortion should absolutely be legal because we would want to make this procedure as safe and accessible as possible. So,
okay, and I apologize if I misunderstood the argument that you were making. So yeah, it really does come down then to whether or not you believe someone in the womb merits moral consideration. That's a fair way of putting it. The position of yes, they deserve moral consideration, but abortion should be legal anyway. That personally pro-life, politically pro-choice. I came into this thinking that was your position, but I think now, having spoken to you more, I was mistaken about that.
Oh yeah, that's okay. I mean, we can move over to the moral pillar is what some of this is contingent upon. I still take a little bit of issue with some prior things, although we kind of moved on from it. If we really consider, for instance, a miscarriage to be a loss of life, I would argue that any time you engage in sexual activity, even if you're on birth control, if you take any alcohol 2 to 7 days after having sex, you're engaging in pretty reckless behavior that could be endangering a potential zygote or fetus. I think there's a lot of weird stuff in there, but we can move from that to the morality argument if you want, in terms of when we actually consider a fetus to be a person.
I don't mind talking about that a little bit more. We've got all kinds of time, and excuse me while I swatted all of these mosquitoes. Mm-hmm. You had mentioned something earlier about if miscarriage truly is loss of life, then we shouldn't, maybe pregnancy itself is immoral because it leads to death. Every pregnancy ultimately leads to death. I don't see any moral.
Sure, I'm just.
Every child ever conceived will someday die.
Well, but that's not a real argument for anything, right? If you go to the doctor and you're feeling a little sick and you're like, I think I have the flu, and the doctor's like, you might, and you're like, well, can I get a prescription? He's like, well, you're going to die anyway. It might be in 6 weeks or it might be in 60 years. We don't typically argue that way in terms of what we should protect life with, right?
Fair, that's fair.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just the idea that this massive loss of life is occurring around us. I feel if we truly believed that those types of early term miscarriages were that level of loss of life, that there are dramatic steps we can take to fix that. And in terms of the pregnancy thing, getting pregnant.
I just don't know what those steps would be at this point in the development of modern medicine.
Well, sure. So basically any sexually active woman should probably constantly be taking prenatal vitamins, because she could become pregnant at any point in time without necessarily being aware of it. Again, even if you're on the pill, or even if you have other forms, even an IUD, you could get pregnant. So those are reasonable steps that somebody could take if they truly believe they're going to cause a loss of life to happen due to negligence. And then things like
I don't think prenatal vitamins prevent miscarriage.
I mean, we can probably, I'm sure that there are some miscarriages, some percentage of miscarriages that are unavoidable, but I'm also sure that there are some miscarriages that happen because the person just has no idea that they're pregnant. I'm sure that happens. I'm sure there's some percentage of that happens. We should probably try to avoid that as much as possible. We really believe that like an early term miscarriage is like the death of a child.
Okay. I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree about the implications of all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I will say, I don't think there's any reason for anyone, whether pro-life or pro-choice, to oppose efforts to, learn more about the causes of miscarriage so that we can try to prevent them. I think that ought to be an area of agreement. I don't see that being a political issue, I hope.
Sure.
Okay, but we can go ahead and move on.
Yeah, we can move to the moral argument in terms of when we consider like a fetus to be a person. Sure.
You had said toward the beginning that you think the defining factor is someone's consciousness, essentially.
Some conscious experience, yeah.
Right. So forgive me for simplifying that, but and you gave some examples of for instance the corpse, of course not a person. The stillborn baby, which is duplicative, that's just a younger corpse, sad to say. The person in a coma who's not going to wake up, irreversible brain damage, about to die. Those types of situations are not given. Those people are not given moral consideration, and I think that's fair. But something else that all of those examples have in common is the fact that they have no future, right? So if the person in the coma did have a possibility of returning to consciousness, that person would merit moral consideration. It's not open season on everybody who's comatose in all situations. So I tend to, and I'm going to totally rip off Don Marquise's argument, but I think it's helpful to start from asking what makes killing wrong in general. You can say that it's a loss for that person's family and friends, and that's.
Well, hello? Uh-oh.
I hope that it's maybe a Wi-Fi or a data going in and out rather than like
her phone dying.
To the
Oh wait, there we go.
Well,
oh, hello, you're back.
Oh, did I freeze up? I'm sorry. What's the last thing you heard me say?
I think you were just saying what makes killing somebody wrong.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I'm not too far behind.
Uh-huh.
So what I said was Don Marquise in his essay kind of goes by process of elimination, proposes various reasons why.
Oh, sorry, Kelsey. I think I'm not sure if it was for everybody else, but it froze for me a bit.
Yeah, it's just a little bit.
No.
Oh.
I actually, Kelsey, if you're able to plug in, the audio is probably even more vital than the picture. And I think if you're able to turn your camera off, it might even make it slightly easier on your phone to keep up with the amount of processing it's doing. I think we lost her, but hopefully we can get her back. So once in a while this happens. So I'm just going to quick switch over to we are waiting on Kelsey. I think that I have a good feeling she'll come back. Otherwise, we might have to sometime down the road do a part 2 to finish the discussion or something. But we, hopefully we get her back. I have a good feeling. Don't worry. Oh, that reminds me though. I'll pause the timer and just mention a couple of. Oh, great! We got her back already. Okay.
You got me?
Yes.
I can't hold on. Hold on. See me? Can you hear?
We cannot see you, but that might be good just because it'll be a little bit less
Is this a real
labor for your phone.
No.
Hello.
Can you hear us? Kelsey? I don't know if she said no or...
I think she was saying no, like, oh no.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Let's see. We might... It still shows like her little box, and that I would think is a good sign, but... Let me check over on the other... Oh, we did lose her. But we might get her back, and we'll give it maybe one more time. And I'll keep an eye on Twitter, because she might DM me on there. Oh, and that reminds me, I do have to plan on putting her link from Facebook into the description. So, stoked for a couple of other upcoming debates that we are really excited about is we do have Dr. Cy Gart and Arnon Ra will be debating on science and religion, in particular biology and religion and God, you could say. And that is going to be coming up not this Sunday, but the last Sunday of this month. So that will be definitely a lot of fun. That's going to be the 28th, as well as Standing for Truth is scheduled to debate Creationist Cat this coming Tuesday. That's going to be a lot of fun. And we also have, oh, that's right. You won't believe this one. Inspiring Philosophy will be debating G-Man. So that's going to be an electric one, I'm sure. And other house cleaning stuff. We do want to plug a few channels that have debates in addition to ours. If you don't know already, somehow, I want to let you know Destiny has a lot of debates. So that's one channel where you can find a lot of debates on a smorgasbord of issues. Then Steve McRae has the Great Debate Community, which regularly has debates and discussions. And he himself, Steve McRae, I think definitely has some debates here and there. I don't know if Non Sequitur Show is still doing debates. I'm happy to plug their debates if they have them. I think the word on the streets is that Non Sequitur Show might be transitioning into a different niche. I'm not sure, to be honest, but whatever they do, we are happy to let you know where these debates are happening. Kelsey, glad to see you.
Hey, what's up?
We can see you.
Hey, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Totally okay. Glad to have you back. We did the house cleaning. We forgot to do some of those little announcements from before. So with that, I think the last thing, because when we got you back, we're basically you were just getting to the issue of what makes it wrong to kill in the first place.
Sure. I'll try to be brief because I know we ate through a bunch of time with technical difficulties, but Don Marquis, who originally put forward this argument in an essay, he kind of goes through a series of possibilities of why killing might be wrong. So, and not specific to abortion, but just in general. So he talks about the loss to the victim's family and friends, which is fine. I mean, that's obviously an aspect of why killing is wrong, but it can't be the only reason, because it's just as wrong to kill a hermit, someone who's less integrated into society. He talks about killing as a moral injury to the killer, and I mean maybe, but that intuitively doesn't quite seem right. And he goes through a number of these possibilities, and what he lands on is that you're depriving the victim of their future experiences. And if that's the case, if the wrongness of the killing doesn't depend on the person's consciousness in that moment, I mean, somebody could sneak into my house and put a gun to my head while I'm sleeping, and I would not be consciously aware of my own death. That wouldn't make it any less wrong. If consciousness in the present moment is less important than what future experiences are being taken away, then it would seem to follow that a fetus should merit moral consideration, because regardless of whether they're conscious of their right to life, consciously experiencing anything in the moment, they have that future, just like the comatose person who's going to wake up has a future. So on that basis, it seems to me that we do have and I think that's a better explanation than present consciousness, because we do extend moral consideration, as I said, to people who are not conscious in the moment and who may not be for a considerable length of time, as in the example of a comatose person.
Okay, so this is an interesting argument that I haven't heard before. So I'm going to ask a few probing questions, because on its face, I feel like I would completely reject this argument. So the question is, what makes killing wrong? So without having thought about this a great deal, because I actually haven't thought about that particular question a great deal, my kind of gut reaction to why are most things wrong, because they tend to violate the autonomy of some agent that we would normally want to have autonomy. Typically in society, most of our laws are hopefully centered around keeping people safe so that they can enjoy the most out of their autonomy. And then when we revoke this autonomy, it's usually for explicit, valuable reasons. So for instance, we don't grant autonomy to 60-year-olds because we don't think they can actually keep themselves safe. So to switch this out and to say that, well, in reality, killing is wrong because we're depriving somebody of their future experiences, that argument sounds not very satisfying to me. Because I can think of like a couple reasons. Firstly, it almost sounds like there are tiers of how wrong a murder is based on the amount of time a person could be expected to have left. So for instance, let's say that we know that somebody's going to die of cancer in 3 months. Is killing that person less wrong than killing somebody that's maybe 25 years old and could be expected to live till 60 or 70? How would you respond to a question like that? I'm curious.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that killing is wrong. I think you can't know how much time a person has left. You can make educated guesses, on an actuarial basis, but the premise, I think, is that any amount of future experience, what right does anybody have to tear away any amount of experience from some other person? Whether they're going to live to be 100 or get hit by a bus tomorrow is kind of beside the point. It's up to that person to at least have the chance to then make the most of their time.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with what you said, but I think it's because you kind of hinted at like what the underlying things. We can kind of talk about future experience, but I don't think that's the important part. I think what you said at the end there, that it's up to them to decide, I think that's the reason why we typically consider killing to be wrong, is because you're removing the autonomy from another person. It's not the idea that we're depriving somebody of their future experience, it's the idea that we're depriving them of their future experience against their will. And in order for somebody to be deprived of a future experience and for us to care about that, that person has to be an agent that's capable of making a decision about their future. So for instance, if I were to go outside and crush a rock, which I can't do because I'm not strong enough to do that, but if I were to crush a rock, I've deprived that rock of future experiences, but we don't really care about the future experiences of the rock because the rock can't make a decision about what it would like its future experience to be. So I would argue that future experience is predicated on something being sentient or conscious, because if it's not having an experience like we have, it doesn't really have any sort of consideration for any kind of future experience. So the same way that like a fetus that's only 2 or 3 months old, much the same as a rock, this doesn't really have a concept of any kind of future experience. It doesn't really have the autonomy of an agent that makes decisions, so we're not really depriving anything that we would consider autonomous of any kind of future experience.
The problem that you run into there is that it just as well justifies infanticide, because an infant has no more autonomous ability to consider what their future experiences should be than a fetus. And I think you run into and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's an underlying idea here that a person has to be aware of their rights to have them. I don't subscribe to that. I do think that it's possible for someone to have rights and not be aware of those rights. To give kind of a silly example, back when the healthcare reform was being debated, that's a bad phrasing. It's constantly being debated. Back when the Affordable Care Act was being drafted and amendments were being put forth and that kind of thing. and there was all kinds of discussion about making sure that children were insured and that children had health care. The Onion put out an article saying, oh, all these people are trying to get more health care and doctor's visits for children, but we went and interviewed children and they don't want to go to the doctor more often. Which is a silly thing. But if you think there's a right to health care, you're probably not going to be convinced by the fact that the kids themselves don't think they have a right to health care or understand that concept. So if you look, take a step back from that and say, okay, the way to solve this problem is to look at someone's ability to be autonomous in the future, you run into the exact same problem that the infant, just like the fetus has that capacity, assuming you don't kill them now, to autonomously direct their future experiences.
So again, I would argue that the difference between, I think it's around, it seems like our ability to have a conscious experience happens around 6 months in the womb. That this is when the prefrontal cortex develops, and this is the area of the brain that we seem to believe it kind of is where consciousness kind of comes from. So if you were to talk about like the conscious experience of a 2-year-old, we could have a meaningful conversation about that. Now, they might not have the wherewithal to choose like the healthiest diet or to crawl in the most advantageous direction, but it is having a conscious experience that we would consider worth protecting. Same thing with a 6-year-old, same thing with a 60-year-old. But something that is in the womb that doesn't have that brain developed yet basically has the same types of preferences as a rock or a tree or any other physical object that exists that doesn't have a conscious experience. We have no way of relating to it or no way of like making any type of moral statement against this thing because it just doesn't have an experience that we can talk about. And talking about potential experiences just puts us in a really weird area that I mean, we can go down that road if we want to talk about like potential experiences, but we run into like antinatalist arguments that I think get pretty hard to argue against.
What do you mean by antinatalist arguments?
Well, if we want to talk about like the potential experiences of anything, I think we would.
Poo baby BTFO duckers.
I think we would make an argument that it's pretty easy to say that all forms of conception, if we want to consider experiences that aren't happening yet, we could argue that all forms of conception are immoral because you're exposing something to a potential suffering that never consented to it. So, for instance, life generally has, if you don't have suffering, you at least are exposed to a risk of suffering. And to take somebody and expose them to that without them actually consenting to it, we would consider this to be immoral in every other aspect of society, even if we believe that most people would be better off for it. So, for instance, if 100 people walked into a church, sermon, and 95 of them came out with $1 million and 5 of them got their arms cut off, even if we said most people came out of that advantageously, we would argue unless you informed them going in that was a possibility, that's a highly immoral act. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I quite follow it. So I understand the obviously life is suffering, yes. Especially now because I'm being eaten alive by mosquitoes, which makes it a little hard for me to focus. So forgive me. But so you're saying that if we treat the fetus as as morally relevant because of their future agency, then whether you abort them or give birth to them, you're harming them. Is that the argument that birth itself would be a harm because because the fetus is not consented to life on the outside?
Well, basically,
and all of the struggles that come with that.
My argument is that moral consideration is granted to things that have an experience like our own. That's my kind of baseline argument. That starts at about 6 months in the womb. If we want to not have that, if we want to say, well, anything that could have a potential experience is something that should have moral consideration, then I would bring up, if we're going to talk about potential experiences, how can you subject anything to potential suffering without getting its consent? That seems to be like a pretty big violation of any creature. It's kind of what I'm saying. So basically, the short version is like, if you want to have a baby and you think that we should consider its experience at all points, even before it's having an experience, well, how do you escape things like antinatalism that says that giving birth to something is exposing it to a potential suffering that it never consented to?
I mean, I obviously I don't buy the antinatalist argument. I think the idea of consenting to your life is just bizarre. But I think it's bizarre at any point, right? Whether you think life begins at conception or at birth.
I agree 100%. So the idea to
Okay.
consenting to your life is bizarre, but that's because a fetus can't consent to anything. It's bizarre because it's unimaginable. It's unimaginable for us to talk about the experience of anything that exists in the womb before 6 months. Now, at 6 to 7 or 8 months, we can start to make guesses because it has that prefrontal cortex. You know, it exists probably in a pretty large room, or I guess not that large at 6 months. It swims around. It can feel warmth. It can hear its mother's voice. It's processing things that we can kind of like relate to. But prior to that, I would agree that it is bizarre that we could ask it to consent to anything because it can't. It doesn't have an experience like ours, which is why I don't think we grant it moral consideration.
Well, I think the ability to consent to anything is something that rises much later in life. I think the ability, and forgive me, I'm just going to find my phone charger because I got the 15% warning. I think you seem to be tying together the concepts of someone being morally relevant and having to get that person's consent for things. I just don't. That's not right though in childhood, and I think you acknowledged before. I mean, that when you're dealing with a child whose ability to make good decisions for themselves is limited or non-existent, consent is impossible as much as you might like to get it. It's just. I think we're just talking about two different things when we're talking about someone being morally relevant for purposes of protecting them from being killed versus getting their consent for how they're going to be raised or what their life is going to be like.
So I guess like my question would be like, if we're talking about the future experience of something, how do you escape when people ask you about like the future experience of like a child that doesn't exist at all yet? So let's say, for instance, like a friend was going to go over and have sex with somebody else and you prevent that from happening. Did you just effectively murder like the creation of a potential fetus, or how do you escape those kinds of problems?
No. So this is one of the objections that Marquise anticipates, and he addresses it better than I can in the in the format of this debate. But basically the idea is you can't violate the rights of an individual who you can't like identify. There's no pointing to whose right is being violated exactly. With abortion, you may or may not agree that the fetus is morally relevant, but you at least know who is dying in this abortion. It's this fetus. Whereas if you have this broader idea of even prior to conception there are rights. I think that's problematic. Now there are some contexts where people have tried to make that argument totally outside of abortion. So, for instance, arguments that people yet to be conceived have the right to a better environment. Environmental protections being justified on the basis of future generations, or you hear it sometimes in the in the context of national debt. How is it moral to impose these debts on people who haven't even been conceived yet? But those are more on a class basis rather than talking about individual.
Sure. So one of the problems we run into, I wish I'd read the paper. I'm not sure the person whose arguments you're referring to. I don't know them fully. So I'll ask you to expand on this. When you say you can't violate the right of an individual that you can't identify, you're engaging in a form of begging the question, because what we're really asking is, what is an individual? So for me, if I say, well, an individual is somebody that has a conscious experience like your own, well, that statement is just as true for me as it is for you. So I'll say you can't violate the right of an individual that you can't identify, but I would argue that a fetus is not identifiable as an individual. But you would say, well, a zygote is identifiable as an individual. And then somebody else might say, well, a sperm and an ovum can be identifiable as parts of an individual, the same way that a fetus isn't a full individual. So really, I don't feel like...
Notice how you just said parts of. That's the rub.
Well, sure, but like...
A sperm by itself, an egg by itself, that don't have a future on their own.
Well, but nothing by itself has a future on its own. A zygote is just, I think, a single cell, or like a collection of very few cells, and that has no future on its own. It has no identifiable brain, no identifiable nervous system. So I mean, like, it needs parts from the mom. The same way that an ovum needs parts from a sperm to come together and form a zygote needs parts from the mom to form a greater whole, and then that thing needs more parts from the mother to develop. I mean, where we draw the line seems to be somewhat arbitrary. I'm going with the conscious experience because that seems to be what we identify with as a thing that makes you granted moral consideration. But if we don't do that, I'm asking, what is the individual in that statement of you can't violate the right of an individual?
I think there's a different, when you talk about, needing more parts and more parts, there's a difference between, so a sperm cell on its own, if it doesn't fertilize an egg, is just going to, die in a couple of days and be done. And same with the egg. If it's not fertilized, then it's gone. Once the two combine, what they need is not more parts. What they need is nutrition. If you're talking about, getting more parts from the mother, and that being a threat to individuality, we all need nutrition throughout our life. We're all growing and changing throughout our lives and taking in more things into our body. I think that becomes nonsensical.
Good.
Well,
2-minute warning.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I would say we have to be really careful with this phrasing, because that's like a pro-choice argument that we just made. So for instance, like to say that a sperm cell will die in a couple days on its own, ovaries die in a couple days on their own. I mean, a fetus will die in a couple days on its own. That's typically how pro-choicers will argue in favor of abortion. A fetus is non-viable outside the womb, so that means it's okay to abort. We can argue that what they need is just nutrition, but that's not really what a fetus needs. It doesn't need nutrition in the same way that I need nutrition. It literally needs to be connected inside of another thing, and then it needs like a specialized environment inside of another biological organism. I think we're going above and beyond just requiring nutrition. Like, we're requiring like the body and the revocation of the autonomy of another like physical biological agent, like all at the same time. I think it's above and beyond just nutrition, I would say.
Okay, and now we've circled around back to bodily autonomy and what is the extent of bodily autonomy. And I should be clear, like I do think bodily autonomy is a value. I don't think it's absolute. I think that you can, have mandatory vaccination. I think, nobody is objecting to an 8-year-old being unable to go into a tattoo parlor and get a tattoo, but it's my body. No, nobody thinks that the right to bodily autonomy is absolute. So it's a question of finding that balance. And I do think, trying to circle back to the original debate topic, that finding that balance is an appropriate role for government and for public policy.
Sure. To be clear, I'm not trying to circle back to the bodily autonomy thing. I was just taking issue with how you defined nutrition. If you say something just needs nutrition to survive, and you're like, okay, cool, and then you clobber me over the head and you hook somebody up to my kidney because their kidneys don't work and their blood is getting poisoned, you're like, well, here you go. You're just providing them nutrition now. I would take issue with the framing of how you've used that word nutrition. I don't think they need nutrition. They need access to my body, much the same way that a fetus growing in a body doesn't just need nutrition. It literally needs access to your body. So I was just taking issue with that framing there of using the word nutrition.
Okay. Fair enough. So I think I
hate to step in. If it's okay if we move into the closings, we've run out of time for the open discussion.
Oh no.
Is this something that you're able to cover in the closing? Otherwise,
yeah, she can take as long. It's okay. I'm not gonna call clock on you. It's fine.
Okay.
Now, I've kind of lost my train of thought, to be honest. I mean, we've gone through a lot of. Oh, I know what I was going to say. The analogy of forced organ donation. I think that's a really good analogy for why it's wrong to get women pregnant when they don't want to be. But once the donation, quote unquote, has occurred, you have a different set of moral considerations. So if you were to try to imagine, and I know that this is a crazy hypothetical, but if you were to imagine, that you go to the hospital for some routine operation, maybe an appendectomy or something, and instead, due to some terrible act of medical negligence, they wind up taking one of your kidneys and giving it to somebody else, and that person is now reliant on your kidney. That's terrible. You should definitely be compensated for that loss of your bodily autonomy under the law. But can you go and stab the guy who has your kidney to get it back? I don't think so. I don't think bodily autonomy extends quite so far as to allow lethal violence in that situation. So that was all I was going to say about that. But if we want to move to just general closings, we've covered obviously a lot of ground this afternoon. I haven't really been able to take notes due to my technological issues that I'm having. I still I'm having some internet issues. I have power back, thankfully, but not full internet. So I'll just say that I've had a really enjoyable experience debating with you. We didn't go a whole lot into the question of, if the child is, if the fetus is worthy of moral consideration, and if abortion is a killing, and if abortion is unjustified, and you are personally pro-life, does it follow that you should also be politically pro-life, or can you take this this step of not wanting to impose your values on someone else? We didn't really talk much about that. Maybe that's something that can come up during Q&A with our listeners. But I would just say that I think the consistent position to take is to be one or the other, politically and personally. Be pro-life and pro-life, or be pro-choice and pro-choice. But I think mixing the two together puts you in a position of having to twist into moral knots.
Gotcha. With that, we will let each of you, if you want to say anything in addition on that issue, you are more than welcome to as we go to the closing statements. You don't have to use all 5 minutes.
That was closing statements. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that we'll consider that you're closing. So sorry about that. No, that's definitely gotcha. And with that, we will go to Destiny's closing statement. So thank you very much, Kelsey. We really appreciate it. And Destiny, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so like I feel like on the pro-choice side, I feel like, or on the pro-life side rather, I feel like it's really difficult to establish a reason for why we should yield more consideration to something that just doesn't have a conscious experience. Once we start to make arguments that kind of defend potential future experiences, we run into all sorts of bizarre moral conundrums that I mean, seem even on their face to be like completely bizarre or completely unsolvable. And even we even start to make arguments that the pro-choicer would use. So, for instance, like, a sperm is meaningfully different from a zygote because, like a really early fetus can't survive on its own. And it's like, well, yeah, of course. These are reasons why we don't grant either of these things moral consideration. I would argue that the most consistent time to do it is when something's having an experience like our own. That when things have experiences, we can relate to them. Obviously, we feel pain, we hear voices, we have our emotions and all these things, and that usually starts around 6 months in the womb. And that any abortion that happens before then, I mean, it's the same thing as crushing a rock or knocking over whatever. That these are things that exist that maybe at one point can have experiences that we should worry about, but until they get to that point, we just don't really consider them. And addressing real quick the thing about like you wake up and you find that somebody has stolen a kidney from you and put it in someone else, it feels wrong or it feels bad. Is they're like, well, hold on, if you take the kidney back, you can't just do that. But I would argue actually you can. I would argue two things in that analogy. One, you can go and take your kidney back from the person, and two, I would concede that it is morally wrong to murder that person. They seem contradictory on their face, but the confusion is that the moral weight of killing that person doesn't actually fall on the person that takes their kidney back. It falls on the person that originally took their kidney from them and gave them to another person. So if we have person A, B, and C, person C steals a kidney from person A and gives it to person B, person A has every right to get their kidney back from person B. It will cause that person to be killed or murdered, but the weight of that murder will every single time fall on person C. And that's how I would address that issue. And that's all I got.
You got it.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We will now move into the Q&A. So for your questions, feel free to submit them into the live chat. We do have a good list already, but if you have any others, you can just help me out a little bit by putting @ModernDayDebate at the start. That'll just tag it so it'll be orange for me and it'll be easier for me to pull those out. But we will start with super chats. The Crawdaddy 029, thanks for your super chat. He says, I always found it very odd that a woman wants to give her body rights up to the government to decide. Can she, I think he means, can Kelsey explain that?
I don't think that I'm giving up anything by saying that other people's children and my children deserve equal protection. This kind of gets back to the point I was making at the very beginning that, that I don't want to see conception lottery, and I don't see that as giving away my bodily rights. If I don't believe that I have a right to commit violence against my children to start with, I don't believe anyone does. So I
Lay
don't see
down
it
your
as
sweet
giving
and weary
anything up.
head. The rainbows is falling.
Gotcha.
You have come
Thank
to
you very
journey's
much.
end.
Next up, we
Sleep now
have
and dream of the one.
Michael Dresden says, don't forget to like and sub if you haven't already. Thanks for your support, Michael. We appreciate that. And by the way, all super chats 100% will go to Save the Children. The 30% that YouTube takes, we as a channel, I'm trying to get in connection with YouTube to ask if they won't take it during our charity streams. But in the meantime, we're just going to use past super chat like money that's come in, and we'll kind of bring that 30% back up so that it's at the full 100%. So next up.
And was there another avenue to donate where that's not an issue? I thought you had mentioned.
Yes, there is. So if you use Streamlabs, there is a link in the description that usually says support the stream, and you can actually make, it's streamlabs.com/modern-day-debate. You can make your donation, and then YouTube doesn't take the 30% out of it. So that basically it goes in through Streamlabs rather than YouTube, and we can read that out loud as well. So thanks for mentioning that, Kelsey. I appreciate that. And Kyle's bookkeeper, I have a feeling this isn't really Kyle's bookkeeper, but they say, excited that 100% of super chats will now go to me. So not quite right. It's still going to Save the Children, but whoever that is, thanks for your donation to Save the Children. The Crawdaddy, thanks for your super chat. He says, please no G-Man. He's a tool. Oh, come on. G-Man is, you gotta love him. He's got passion, and we're thankful that he comes on. He's a character. Next up, we've got the Crawdaddy 029. Thanks again for your super chat. He says, so you're saying parents are obligated to give their newborn their blood or organs if needed, simply because the newborn can have a future? I think that's for Kelsey.
I think I think newborns present a different case just because support for the newborn could potentially come from other sources. I think we would definitely look askance at a parent who refused to give blood to their needy child for no reason other than that they didn't feel like it. But we have blood banks, we have collective responsibility for that, where we've created a structure so that is not a moral dilemma.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. We appreciate it. And then we have new subscribers. I missed a lot of these. So sorry. It was just flying, and I'm a little bit extra scattered today. So Hunter Fight, we appreciate you subscribing. And
wait, actually, could I ask a question on that? Actually, I'm really curious on that, because you kind of sidestepped that a little. Let's say, for instance, there wasn't another kidney available, and let's say that you had a child that was 6 years old, and that child needed a kidney to survive. Do you think that a parent should be compelled by threat of state violence to donate a kidney to that child, or that if the child died, the parent would be held legally responsible?
I think under current law, that parent would likely be held responsible for child neglect.
If you think if your child dies because you don't donate a kidney to your child, that the parent, so ignoring current law, just morally, you think that the parent,
under current law, that's a possibility. I'm not a criminal attorney, but my understanding of that area of law is that denying medical care to your child is considered a form of
not just denying medical care, but that you yourself should be compelled by the state, that you, to be a moral person too, that you should give your kidney to your child. If your child is 6 years old, they have a kidney problem, they need a kidney to survive, that you should absolutely be morally compelled and legally compelled to do that. Do you think so? Otherwise you're being...
Well, morally, I think absolutely. Legally, I don't know if that situation has come up before. I think there is a possibility under current law that refusal to do so would be medical neglect of your child.
Sure,
I don't know that for a fact because I'm not sure if it's come up.
Yeah, so not answering the current legal question.
Possibility that's already the law.
But do you think that should be the law, that a parent should be forced, much the same way that you would argue somebody should be forced to carry a child to term under the law? Do you think that a parent should be forced to donate their kidney to the child?
So I think probably a better analogy is the liver. If we're trying to analogize this to pregnancy, which is over after 9 months and your uterus goes back to its normal size, the liver can be donated partially and will regrow. So I think if we make that the analogy, yeah, I don't know why that seems horribly selfish for a parent not to donate to their dying child.
Okay, so you would argue that the parent should be compelled. I would take issue with the idea that
Yeah.
the uterus goes back to its normal size, because pregnancy does cause irreversible changes to your body. But even when we grant that, you would say that the law should say that the parent, under threat of state violence, should absolutely be compelled to donate a part of their body to their child. That they don't have an option there; they have to.
I mean, you're saying threat of state violence like someone's putting a gun to their head. But
Well, because that's how
someone,
the
I
law
think if
works,
someone
right?
were to fail, I think if someone were to fail to donate their liver in that situation, and the child died, they would likely be charged with some form of negligent homicide.
Okay, sure.
And I think that prosecution would be just.
Okay.
Gotcha. Next up, thanks very much, both of you. We have another question, or I should say these are, yeah, so thanks for those new subscribers and questions. We have one from Shirt Son. What should the best policies be to reduce the number of abortions? I think that might be for both speakers.
I hope it is, because I think this is an area of a lot of common ground.
Mhm.
Secular Pro-Life is a big supporter of comprehensive sex education. We support, the use of condoms to prevent unplanned pregnancies and the spread of STDs. We support just, in general, better support services for women, particularly those who are economically vulnerable, who are single mothers to older children already. All of those things I think ought to be common ground measures. And we have seen reductions in abortion rates from implementation of not full-blown abortion bans, since none of those have gone into effect since Roe, but from, for example, requirements of informed consent.
Soy boy.
That the abortion clinic has to present information on prenatal development prior to an abortion. Requiring parental notification before an abortion on a minor, so that the parents have an opportunity to step in and say, now, hold on, wait, we are going to support you. This is not going to ruin your life. We're not shaming you. We're here to help. Those kinds of incremental measures have been shown to reduce abortion rates.
I mean, I would argue that reducing abortion in terms of making it so that a pregnancy never happens is really good. So things like contraceptive use, sex education, these are really good things. I would say that threatening people, so for instance, I don't agree with the framing that parental consent is a way to make it so that the parents can provide support to the child for their future child. Parents can't. They're, like, short of adoption, having a child is a lifelong commitment. Like, the fact that your parents will help you through it a little bit isn't going to change the impact that that's going to have on your life. These seem to be roadblocks that people put up just to make it impossible for somebody to get an abortion. I don't think that people are genuinely reconsidering their abortion when you go to a doctor and they're forced to show you pictures of, like, a terminated fetus or something. I would reject the framing of that.
Gotcha.
I'm not sure how else informed consent could have an impact on abortion rates if women aren't changing their mind. It doesn't add to the cost of an abortion to have that informed consent in process. And I don't believe it involves photos of dead babies either. The
what
point
other
I was
types?
trying to
Sorry.
make on parental notification was not so. I may have phrased it badly. What I had in mind was, the teenager who gets pregnant and freaks out and thinks, oh my God, I have to hide this from my parents. They're going to kill me. They're going to freak out. I have to go get a secret abortion. And then she may be pleasantly surprised to find out that her parents actually are supportive and will love her. Like that's what I had in mind when I said support.
Well, I mean, like, is that up for the doctor to decide, though? Like, there are cases where the parents, they're not going to kill the child, but they will legitimately, like, make the life hell for the child that actually gets pregnant. I mean, I don't know if I would want a medical institution to decide how my parents are going to feel about a medical procedure, because it may very well be that they are going to be absolutely upset and want to kill me for getting pregnant at an early age. So, I mean, it seems like we don't require that for any other type of thing, so I don't know why we would here, but...
I think we do generally require parental consent for surgeries on minors. Abortion is the exception. I I can't think of any other surgical procedure that a child can have without their parents knowing about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, but to your point about abusive situations, there is a procedure called judicial bypass created by the Supreme Court where a judge can evaluate potential abusive situations and make appropriate referrals and waive the parental notification requirement. But that's a very rare scenario.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, we will go to Darth Calculus. Thanks for your question. It is, for either, do you think there is a similarity between abortion and drugs regarding the phrase, they're going to do it anyway, so just make it legal?
I think similar arguments are being made. I don't know. What do you think, Stephen?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar, but like the morality behind both of these is a lot different, right? Like, yeah. If they're gonna do it anyway, then just like make it legal and make it safe is a good argument, unless you believe that there's like a moral wrong being committed, right? So I mean, that's what the question comes down to.
Right. I mean, with drug use, the only person you can hurt is yourself, unless you're off driving while intoxicated, which we can all agree is a problem.
And there are laws against that, regardless. So.
Right.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Walter White. Thanks for your question. And Walter asks, when would you say it is no longer okay to abort? Is there a biological answer to it?
I mean, I would say at around 6 months is when the fetus begins to develop the parts of its brain needed to have a conscious experience, which seems to be what we're most interested in with people. That if I could remove one part of the body to make it so that you don't think a person is worthy of moral consideration, it would probably be that part of a brain that gives you an experience.
Gotcha. I think, Kelsey, if you want to answer too, you can.
Oh, I just assumed the question was for him. I mean, I don't think abortion is appropriate at any point in pregnancy, but to the second half of that question of can biology answer it? Not really. But I mean, biology can inform the discussion, but there's no personhood organ that forms at this particular second. The science is helpful, but it's not going to be dispositive of the moral question.
Gotcha. Next, Mark Caesar has a question for you, Kelsey. Thanks. And yes, could you ask Kelsey when she considers a fertilized egg to be a viable human?
I'm not entirely sure what she means by that. So viability is an interesting concept. It's really a Supreme Court created concept by setting it at 24 weeks. So viability as a legal concept or as a legal / medical concept is the point at which the baby can survive outside the womb. Legally, it's been set at 24 weeks, but on the ground, it's going to vary tremendously from person to person, right? So we all grow at different rates. Different people are different, and the environment matters as well. So to take, for example, a woman who lives within walking distance of a hospital with a fantastic NICU versus a mother in a more rural area that doesn't have good hospital access. Maybe they're the same number of weeks along in pregnancy, but the one would survive and the other wouldn't, just based on how far away the NICU is. And of course, then either one of them could travel during the, so the viability idea is very subjective. And that's why the Supreme Court has set it at 24 weeks, not because babies can't survive before that point. Some can and have, but it's just an arbitrary policymaking decision from the court. So if the question is when, if you're defining viability as when someone can survive outside the womb, that's the answer. If there's some other definition of viability being used, then I'm not sure.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next, Slam, and thanks for that question, Mark. Slam RN, thanks for your question. She asks, is Destiny familiar with the quote-unquote Complete Lives program? And they ask, or is Kelsey familiar with it?
I am not. No, I'd like to know what that is.
You got it. It's new to me as well, but I think I saw another question from Slam RN. Thanks for your second question. And that is, does Kelsey have an opinion on how minorities are targeted and the beliefs of Margaret Sanger in eugenics?
Yeah, so we could do several videos on that topic. I'll try to be brief. I think certainly in the earlier days of the abortion movement, there was an unpleasant racial component. Justice Ginsburg, who was not on the court at the time Roe v. Wade was decided, she joined later, but she commented that she was surprised that the same court that set down Roe later allowed prohibitions on taxpayer funding of abortion, because she thought Roe was geared toward not having too many of the populations we don't want too many of, which is a frightening thing. So yes, race does matter, and we do to this day see a disproportionate, in terms of the percentage of Black women in the population versus the percentage of abortion clients who are Black. It's a disturbing discrepancy, but I would not go so far as to suggest that every abortion clinic owner today is some kind of eugenicist. I think that history is there and that it still has some influence, but you also have to consider how much of abortion is driven by financial crisis, and that financial crisis is more likely to occur among people of color. So that explains at least part of the variation.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, we will hopefully we're going to get to as many questions as we can. We have a late influx of them, and we have to close the Q&A intake just as we got a lot of questions, and we're trying to speed through these as fast as possible. So Landon Freeman, thanks for your question. We appreciate it. For Destiny, if pro-abortion advocates have such a compelling case, why do many rely on ad hominem strawmen and euphemisms?
I mean, every person relies on ad hominems and euphemisms. It's just, I mean, that's every side of every political debate ever.
Gotcha. Thanks.
You've been very good today.
Thanks.
Next up, thanks for your question, Stanislas Belongo. We appreciate it. They asked for Destiny, do you have a defeater for the Jesse Lee Peterson's pro-life analogy?
Well, I think that's a dumb meme. I don't think he's asking a real question. I don't even know what that is.
Gotcha. I appreciate it. Comrade, thanks for your question. It says, Stephen says we should extend moral rights to beings with conscious experiences, but not potential conscious experiences. Does that mean it's okay to kill someone who is asleep?
I don't think so. I think there's a continuation of the conscious experience there, that like somebody that goes to sleep and then wakes up is having like a conscious experience that's been temporarily interrupted. I think this is meaningfully different than something that has never had a conscious experience at any point in its life. So for instance, like we wouldn't say that a sleeping person has the same sort of experience as like a rock that never has and never will have a conscious experience.
Gotcha. Next up, thanks for that question. Fierce Deity asks, will you make up with Hassan in this abortion debate?
This is another meme. Go to the next one.
Gotcha. Okay. Next, Walter White asked, Kelsey, when does life begin for you? Yamanaka won a Nobel Prize for turning a liver cell in an embryo. So is drinking a beer that kills liver cells abortion?
So someone took a liver cell and turned it into an embryo, is what he's saying?
I think so.
I am not familiar with that research. I take issue with the framing of the question of when does life begin for you. I don't think that is the sort of question that is reliant upon a person's subjective experience. I think life begins when the overwhelming scientific consensus says it begins, which is when sperm meets egg. This idea, and I'm not suggesting that that Stephen holds to this, or even that it's all that prevalent, but I have seen this sort of idea that the life of any particular embryo or fetus begins when the mother decides that it begins, almost as though we have like a supernatural ability to, like, through the power of our own thoughts, create life. I'm all about girl power. Women are awesome, but we can't do that. That's just out there.
Gotcha. Thanks for your response. And Kent Hoven's CPA, don't think it's his real CPA, but they sent a super chat. Thanks for that super chat. I don't understand what this means. They said, I've had it up to here with fetuses. Is that nope.
Okay.
I don't get it. But thanks for your donation to save the children. I don't know the slang anymore, if that was slang. But anyway, Ashley Juliet, thanks for your question. They asked, Destiny, what happens to bodily autonomy of the mother if you believe abortions after 6 months ought to be regulated?
The bodily autonomy of the mother isn't really considered at that point if we consider that the fetus is something that ought to have moral consideration granted to it. So, for instance, we would say that, like, stealing money from a person is wrong, and telling somebody that they, like, have to give money to somebody, unless we want to make tax arguments, is generally wrong. But, like, we wouldn't say that, well, paying child support is wrong, because we'll violate that autonomy in that case because we're protecting, like, the future or the autonomy of another, like, currently existing thing. So autonomy is relevant when you're talking about, like, having an abortion, because I don't consider the fetus to be a living person. But past 6 months when it is, well, the autonomy of the mother doesn't override the autonomy of the fetus to survive at that point, of the thing that's 6 months old.
You got it. Thanks so much. Next up, Jesus is Lord asks, question for Destiny, do you think a child who survives a botched or failed abortion should be killed?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wait, what was it? What was the question? I'm sorry, it cut out a little.
That's all right. As they asked, do you think a child who survives a botched or failed abortion should be killed? I think they mean, like, immediately after the abortion.
Right, like born alive in the course of an abortion procedure, I think is what they mean.
I mean, if it's less than 6 months, if it doesn't have its, like, brain developed or whatever, then sure. I mean, I wouldn't consider that a murder. But I mean, if it's post 6 months, I don't think you should be having that abortion anyway, because that does have a conscious experience and it ought to have moral consideration.
Gotcha.
I've got to push back. So before 6, so let's say, like, I think the earliest surviving is like maybe 22 or 23 weeks, just short of your 6 month cutoff. Are you suggesting that even though that baby is now outside the womb and not a direct threat to anybody's bodily autonomy, they should nonetheless be killed because the mom just doesn't want to have a baby out there, isn't interested in placing for adoption? You think that is a sufficient justification at that stage?
Yeah, of course. I don't need a justification because I don't consider it something worthy of moral consideration. Much the same that I don't need sufficient justification to trim my nails, over a sink. I mean, like, the flip side of that is that fertility clinics that store, unused zygotes that haven't been implanted yet are committing, again, another sort of genocide when they dump these at the end of the month because they're no longer viable. I mean, I wouldn't consider that to be like a mass murder being carried out by a fertility clinic, because these are things that I don't grant moral consideration to.
I think you're putting yourself in a corner with respect to premature infants. But we can move.
Well, how? I mean, the onus is on you to establish why moral consideration should be granted. I granted at a state of having a conscious experience, and I don't believe that we fully fleshed out or that you fully justified an alternative position there in terms of when you would grant moral consideration to anything.
Well, I thought the whole point of any right to abortion was to vindicate bodily autonomy. If you're saying, go ahead and kill the premature infant who doesn't have a conscious experience, that's going way beyond a right to abortion. That's creating essentially a right to a dead baby.
I don't know how the bodily autonomy thing plays in here. It's more just what do we?
Because we're talking about a baby that has exited the womb in a botched abortion procedure. Baby made it out alive. why would the mother then have any say over what happens to the life of that baby?
Yeah, so again, the phrasing here is a form of begging the question. We're saying the baby made it alive. You're already winning your conclusion just on that framing. I wouldn't say that a baby made it out. I would say that a fetus or a
22-week-old.
Yeah, sure, a 22-week-old.
Whatever the heck it is, once out of the mother's body, why should the woman then what interest does she have in that child's life or death? Why would she at that point be the decision maker when bodily autonomy isn't on the table with that?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I would argue that whatever came out would be the possession of that person, and that we should respect their right to whatever comes out of their body. So much the same way that, like, if I went to the hospital and I had a kidney removed, I think I should probably have, like, a right to hold on to that. I'm not sure what the legislation says right now. Like, can a doctor, like, steal that body part from you if they take it out, or do you have the right to, like, walk away with it? But no, I mean, whatever comes out.
I think it has to be disposed of as medical waste pursuant to,
Okay, sure. Then yeah, then whatever the law is,
right.
Sure, whatever the law is, it would be disposed of. Then I guess it's medical waste. Then, but no, I don't. I mean, like, I guess if you consented to it, you could.
Wow.
If you want to take.
I cannot disagree with you more strongly. I think that's wow.
Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that you can't, but you haven't provided any reason why moral consideration should be granted besides some vague intuitionism. The idea that, like, well, of course it's alive because it's a baby. But you haven't really established any reason why we should give moral consideration to that group of cells. Any of the same as a tumor being pulled out of somebody versus a 22-week-old fetus that doesn't have a conscious experience.
The fetus has now left the body, is no longer a fetus, is a prematurely born neonate. And you're saying because that infant exited the body of this person, that she now has, like, possession over that premature infant as a thing, like no.
Forgive me, I want to get
possession of a human being is just messed up. We can.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, I understand we can move on, but again, like, we've engaged in so much begging the question. Like, you're constantly seeking the conclusion. Like, how can you have possession of a human being? Well, I'm not saying it's a human being. Okay, but the baby is come out of you. But I'm not saying it's a baby. Okay, but, like, that's a person. I'm not saying it's a person. Like, you constantly beg the question with your phrasing. You're not really engaging with the idea that, like, it's not a person.
I'm not trying to beg the question. I guess I came into this discussion assuming that you wouldn't condone infanticide, that we were only talking about a right to abortion, of a killing taking place within the uterus. I thought that's what we were arguing about, and it has turned out that your position goes beyond.
I don't think a person's, like, whether or not they're given moral consideration is determined by geographic location. I wouldn't say you could kill a person in a uterus. I mean, I don't think you should be able to abort somebody at 7 or 8 months. That's a ridiculous proposition. So somebody becomes a human only once they're born? Like, the passage through somebody's stomach or vagina makes you a person?
I agree that that's ridiculous. It's current law.
Wait, you can have late-term abortions are legal in all parts of the United States? I was not aware of that. I'm almost positive that's not true, but I don't know.
Yes. So doctors who will do them are few and far between. It's not like there's one in all 50 states, but under the Supreme Court precedent, you don't have you don't have the right to life as a person under the Constitution until birth.
Okay. I don't know if that's true or not, but yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, but my only point is that we haven't really established why these things should be granted personhood, but that was my only point. And then, sorry, I'll stop.
I just wanted to give Stephen a chance to respond, and then I will get to these last questions really quick, if that's all right. So next up, Awesome Brawler says, "Hello, Bunnell. Wanna chat tomorrow?" Must be somebody you know. Am I pronouncing it right? Is it Bunnell?
Yeah, it's just another meme guy.
Gotcha. And AHM, thanks for your question. They said, for Destiny, why is he not willing to debate abortion with Raj Patel?
That's another dumb meme. Skip him. He's just people do.
Gotcha. Sorry. You got a lot of fans following you over here. Thanks for your question. Okay. That was actually a question for somebody else in the chat. Sorry about that. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to our speakers who are linked in the description. So if you have enjoyed this, if you're like, oh man, I really want to hear more, actually, I would encourage you, go check out their links so that you can hear more of their content, read more of their content, and maybe subscribe for emails or videos, whatever you like. So thanks so much to our speakers for being here, hopping in the hot seat. And
Thanks for having me.
our pleasure. Yeah, you bet. And so with that, I want to say also thanks everybody for your questions, really interesting questions, as well as thanks for your super chats. As mentioned, 100% will be going to Save the Children. And also excited that tomorrow Kent Hovind will be on debating with Mr. Archaeopteryx is his alias, as that will be a big event. So thanks for coming by, everybody. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. We're glad to have you here, and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for coming on. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of audio.
Yeah, no problem. All right, I'm going to hop off, okay?
Thank you guys so much for coming on. Totally appreciate it. Let me know if there's any way that like I could help you. You guys, I just really appreciate that you're willing to come on here, because I know there are a lot of places to debate.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so
Sorry, were you still saying?
let me know if there's anything else.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll see you guys later. Peace out. Jesus Christ. Let's try, we'll try like just one like razor simple example, okay?
Sure,
So,
go for it.
okay, so we'll keep talking about like climate change.